Hello, and welcome to another Funding the Future podcast. Our guest today is Larry Elliott. Larry will be known to many of you. Larry was the economics editor of The Guardian from 1988 to 2024, a feat that I am pretty sure nobody will ever repeat. If you look on the web, there's remarkably little about Larry. He was apparently born 70 years ago. Happy birthday, very recently. And he went to school, went to university, got a job on a local paper, worked for the Press Association, joined The Guardian in 1988, retired in November 2024, which I can confirm because I was at his retirement bash, picked up a CBE, and is now writing a book, which he assures me is just about to pop on its way to the publisher, and we'll pick that point up later on. But Larry, welcome.
Hello, Richard. Good to see you.
And of course, I should mention that along the way, you and I have been members of the Green New Deal group for a long time, since about 2007 or 8. And so we've been around each other's company and scene for quite a while. So this is nothing unfamiliar to either of us.
No, we're old mates.
Yeah. I do recall the day when I was once walking across the foyer of King's Cross and I heard this voice bellow out, "Comrade!" And that was you giving me a yell from the far side of the station. I knew it was nobody else who was going to shout that at that moment. But there we go. Now you know what we call each other. Langley, I want to start with a very specific question because we could go back deep in time and your track record will give us plenty of opportunity to do that. We're interested in the moment, by and large, on this podcast, on my blog. And I wanted to pick up an article that you wrote only a week or so ago for The Guardian, for whom you're now a fortnightly columnist, I think it's fair to say.
That's right.
And I liked the column. Now, in fairness, I thought this really summarizes the world. And I just want to pick it up and give a hint of it because I think it can frame our conversation. And what you said is that with the budget, the UK budget, due in the UK on November the 26th, Rachel Reeves will be at the dispatch box. One thing is very clear, you said, and that is that she has been boxed into a corner. Taxes look set to rise sharply, despite a weak economy, and the government sliding in the polls. And it's not what she wants to do, but the technocratic rules, you said, around UK economic policy leave her with no room to manoeuvre. Since Gordon Brown created the Office for Budget Responsibility back in 1997, an event...
Actually, it was George Osborne.
Oh, Osborne created that. Fiscal rules were created by Gordon Brown. And obviously, I think the Office for Budget Responsibility is merely the mechanism for enforcing them. So I stand corrected, but I also contextualize the comment and the mistake. And of course, the fact that since I'm now right, 1998, the Bank of England has been setting interest rates. Basically, fiscal policy is outsourced to the OBR and monetary policy is outsourced to the Bank of England. And so what really has Rachel Reeves got left to talk about? That's the point you were making. Please, embellish, tell us more. You obviously feel that this is a mistake.
It's clearly a mistake. I mean, the economy doesn't need tax rises at this point. I mean, the economy's weak, growth is weak, and Rachel has boxed herself firmly into a corner. I mean, the OBR is going to tell her what to do effectively on November the 26th. It will say that if she carries on without raising taxes, she will break her own fiscal rule. But the fiscal rule is nonsense in my view, because it effectively says that in 4 years' time, current tax receipts must exceed current public spending, and that's based not on hard evidence, but on a series of assumptions and effectively, in my view, basically guesswork as to what the state of the economy is going to be like in 4 years' time. So in essence, Rachel is going to make herself incredibly unpopular and she's going to do damage to the economy, probably already doing damage to the economy because of the speculation about which taxes are going to rise and by how much for totally spurious reasons. And in my view, if you're going to have fiscal rules, let's have fiscal rules that make sense rather than fiscal rules that make no sense. I mean, in my view, we should have we should broaden out the rules to include real economy variables rather than just notional fiscal rules. I mean, what's wrong with having a rule which says by the end of the parliament, child poverty should be on the way down, or that wealth should be more evenly distributed? If we can have some rules, let's have some meaningful rules rather than rules which are, in my view, pointless and damaging.
Are the Office for National Statistics, because ONS won't be a term familiar to everyone, are they up to measuring those alternatives? Do we need different metrics altogether, different people to even measure the metrics to ensure that they would be robust? Because having a rule but not being able to measure the outcome would, I guess, not be a great idea.
But I mean, I think you could. I think the ONS probably could measure the number of people living below the government's poverty line. I mean, it has done so for many, many years, and therefore, logically, it should be able to measure the number of people. I mean, that was just an example of the sort of things the government could be basing policy on, rather than on these pointless OBR targets. I mean, the OBR is good. I don't really blame the OBR for this. I blame the politicians for their outsourcing of policy. I mean, the OBR is just doing what the OBR is being told to do, which is to assess whether the fiscal rule that Rachel has set herself is going to be met or not. So to the extent that Rachel is boxed in, she's boxed herself in by coming up with a fiscal rule which makes no sense and is going to be measured in a way which is going to damage the economy.
Two other things that a lot of people talk about when it comes to an alternative fiscal rule, with which I would entirely agree, by the way. If we're to have a fiscal rule, it's got to be a meaningful one. One would obviously be climate change, which we've had an interest in common for a long time around the Green New Deal. The other one, full employment. Should they be in the mix, or is having too many variables in there another way to be boxed in at the end of the day, a recipe for failure?
Well, I've got no objection to. I mean, this comes back to your argument about whether you can measure these things or not. I mean, climate change, is that going to be based around UK emissions or global emissions? I mean, to an extent, Britain has outsourced its climate change goals to other countries by actually wiping out the coal industry and most of the manufacturing. So effectively, China does most of the carbon emissions for the UK these days. So I mean, that is quite a difficult one to measure, I would have thought. But full employment, what's wrong with that? I mean, what is wrong? I mean, this really brings us on to the other pillar of macroeconomic policy, which is the Bank of England. I mean, what the Bank of England's inflation target is 2%, which it hasn't hit for at least the last 3 years, and it's got its remit is so narrow, and again, it can't really hit it. And the idea that the Bank of England can hit a specific inflation target using interest rates is for the birds, I think. Inflation is not a function of what the Bank of England does. The reason inflation went to 11% back in 2021 was not because the Bank of England failed to raise interest rates fast enough. It was because of the war in Ukraine and the impact that had on oil, energy, and food prices. And I think you've said this, Richard, that the default position for inflation is for it to be low. Inflation normally only goes up during periods of during wars. I mean, in Britain's case, inflation went up during the Napoleonic War, went up again during the First World War, went up again during the Second World War, and the only time it's really ever gone up in peacetime was in the 1970s, when there were specific circumstances. I mean, if you look back, the whole of the 19th century, the level of prices, not inflation, level of prices on the eve of the First World War was actually lower than it was at the end of the Napoleonic War. So you had a whole century, effectively, where there were no major wars involving all the great powers of Europe, in which prices actually ended the 100-year period lower than they'd started it, which is a quite a remarkable state of affairs. But it just goes to show that if you have a relatively competitive economy and you have peace, then you don't get very high inflation. So
Well, we also had something else that happened then, which was technical innovation, which did actually deliver well-being for the population at large. So food
Yeah.
prices fell partly because railways made it possible to actually get hold of food outside your locality. And so suddenly it was actually possible for there to be, well, not necessarily a competitive market, but a more competitive market and a more steady supply, perhaps more importantly, of products. And so technology worked. Technology doesn't work now. You've talked about that. You're concerned about technology. How does that play into all of this? I'll come back to the Bank of England, but I'm picking up that idea first of all.
Yeah, I think that with two things really. We lack the technological breakthroughs that we saw at the end of the 19th century. I mean, the so-called fourth industrial revolution to me doesn't stack up as a as a as a fundamental change in the way that some of the things did at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And secondly, we've not found a way of making sure that everybody benefits from the technological change and the productivity improvements that those changes bring about. I mean, one of the interesting things about the period between 1850 and 1950 was that it saw the gradual improvement in the living standards of ordinary people. And that was brought about because attempts were made to knock the rough edges off the harsh capitalism which started the 19th century. So you had the growth of the trade union movement, you had progressive taxation, you had the extension of the franchise to everybody, and you had the growth of a party, the Labour Party, which was there to represent working people. So there was the two things happened during that period. You had big technological change, and you also had an attempt to make sure that those changes were more beneficial to a larger number of people. I don't actually see that happening now. I mean, to the extent that AI is a technological change, I'm very, very wary about its impact. It
Yes.
seems to me to be quite likely to destroy quite a lot of middle-ranking white-collar jobs in a way that previous waves of technology have tended to get rid of lower skilled jobs. This is not going to do this. Potentially is not going to do that. And the second point is, it seems to me that it's just going to benefit the owners of those companies rather than the bulk of the population.
So are we heading for a bubble with regard to AI? I think that. I think you've hinted at that. Do you think it is still likely? You haven't said that for a few weeks, but I know you hinted that there was obviously a risk.
I did write a piece a few weeks ago saying that it had a feel of a bubble to me about it. I mean, I think that, generally speaking, there's a big financial crisis once every 10 or 15 years.
Yep.
It's been 15 years since the last one. Quite a lot of the same, you hear quite a lot of the same sentiments being bandied around the markets, which is, it's different this time. There's a new technological paradigm. The market can sustain these levels and I think, unfortunately, there is an inbuilt bias in the system towards bubbles, because if you're a fund manager or even if you're a pension fund trustee, you don't want to miss out on the last stages of the boom.
You take the risk.
People know that it feels a bit like a bubble, but they don't want to be the ones who call the end of the dance too early, for fear they're going to get sacked. So you end up with the bubble inflating until it eventually pops. And I would be amazed if this were to carry on for very much longer. I mean, it's a mug's game saying that when the bubble is going to burst, but it does feel very much like a bubble to me.
Let me take you back then to the Bank of England, because obviously they are running monetary policy and appearing to me, and from what you say to you, running it in a way that is completely detached from reality, because they're pretending that changing the interest rate will somehow change the inflation rate, when the factors that are creating inflation are actually entirely exogenous and utterly uninfluenced by the interest rate. But do they have any real awareness of the other risks? Because, of course, they're a regulator of banks, of insurance companies, and so on, the Prudential Regulatory Authority and things, all wrapped up in there. You spent more time at Bank of England press conferences than is probably healthy for any human being. Yeah, I see you sort of puff out your cheeks in response, and I understand why. And do you think they really are on top of the game? Because I've never believed that any of the governors that I've witnessed throughout my career, and it's almost as long as yours, have actually really understood the world outside Threadneedle Street.
I suspect that you're right about that. I mean, back in the early days of Bank of England independence, from 2003 to 2013, Mervyn King was governor, and he had no real interest in financial stability side of the bank's work. He saw the bank purely as a monetary policy organisation, which was there to hit the inflation target using interest rates. And in fact, it did manage to do that for most of that period, but only because of, as you say, exogenous factors, mainly because of globalization and
Yes.
the arrival in the global economy of China. China arrived, flooded the world with a lot of cheap manufactured goods, and it bore down on inflation and enabled the Bank of England to hit the inflation targets. To me, it's as simple as that. Since things have become since things have become more complicated post 2008, the bank's record has been much worse, and that seems to me to suggest that it has real trouble in hitting an inflation target using this one policy tool. I mean, the other thing that happened is that since the crisis of 2008, the bank has taken back supervision of the financial system from the essentially now has two jobs, which is one to hit the inflation target, two to ensure financial stability. I mean, so far there has been no repeat of the 2008 crisis. If it comes, I don't think it's going to come from the same source. I mean, I think it's unlikely it's going to come from the big commercial banks. It's much more likely to come from hedge funds, money market funds, which are effectively unregulated and unsupervised. So that's where I think the blind spot is.
For shadow banking, those hedge funds and so on are now 50% of financing, fundamentally.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've let that happen. So is the Bank of England negligent in its role as a regulator then?
It probably is. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know how it could regulate some of these hedge funds. Really, has it got a mandate to do so? I'm not sure it has.
Yeah, that's the difficulty. You're a fan of capital controls. We've talked about these ourselves over a lunch, a glass of wine or two in our time. Do you think they have a role to play in this situation to help regulate what's going on and give the information and the decision-making power about them to an authority like the Bank of England, in or out of the control of the Treasury?
I'm a big fan of capital controls. I think that there was, if you go back to the period after the Second World War, where capital controls were enforced in most of the Western world, it was a period, A, of very strong growth, B, of democratic growth, so everybody gained, a rising tide lifted all boats, and C, a period in which financial crises were almost absent. So governments were able to pursue domestic policy goals free from the fear that they were going to be blown out of the water by a run on their currency or by sell off of their bonds. So I think that a return to capital controls, and this is one of the things that the book I'm writing talks about, is essential if we're going to actually revive the British economy. Yes, I mean it's incredibly difficult. But the difficulty is not, are they a good thing or not? In my view, it's a question of how you get them past the financial sector, which would kick and scream and create merry hell if you actually mention the very terms. But I mean, even the IMF now accepts that there is, in circumstances, a case for capital controls. I mean, I think that the problem is that it's not capital so much, and I'm not saying that we should stop all capital flows. We should try and stop the very rapid movements in and out of countries of capital. I mean,
so the speculative flows.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you say that they will yell and scream and holler, and of course, I mean, you're right. I mean, they will. We both know that. And I witnessed that for a long time in my work on tax justice. And I was told that what I wanted to do, country by country reporting, could not be achieved. I remember EY telling me they didn't know where their clients undertook their transactions. And I said, well, then you've got a big audit problem then, haven't you? Because you can't tell me as a result whether they're paying the right amount of tax, and as a consequence, their accounts aren't true and fair. They thought about that and decided they did know where their clients undertook their transactions, but they couldn't possibly account in that way. But in the end, they can be persuaded. So do you think that if there's a greater, how do we persuade the politicians, the Bank of England, the regulators, that there's a greater need, which is to actually stabilise society, and it's their job to actually hear that message?
I think there has to be a campaign organised around progressive political parties and the trade union movement to actually push for politicians to make those fundamental changes. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, capital controls are impossible up until the moment that they become possible or inevitable. I mean, who would have thought back in 2008 that we would have, mass buying of government bonds by the Bank of England? Who would have thought this time last year that we would have tariffs imposed in the world's biggest economy? I mean, all these things, are proved to be totally possible and totally logical when push comes to shove. So I think you're right that the idea that there is only one model of capital or one way of running the economy is completely fallacious. There are even now there are very many different ways of organising a capitalist economy. The Scandinavian model of capitalism is completely different from the American one, which is completely different from the Singaporean one. So the idea that you can't capitalism and capitalists will adjust to any system that's in operation. So I agree with you. I think that if we thought capital controls were necessary and were useful, which I do, that a way could be found of making them work and making them acceptable. And I think
what one thought occurred to me, Larry, and it was that you actually have to be our age to remember the time when you had to take your passport to the post office or to a bank to be stamped to get your 100 quid to be allowed to go on holiday.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would be that popular.
No, I don't think that's necessary, but it's just
I don't think that's necessary. But I mean, I think a system. I mean, just look at one example: the financial transaction tax, which was quite a modest proposal, really, which was to tax foreign exchange debt. I mean, it goes all the way back to James Tobin in the early 1970s,
Yeah.
but it was quite a modest proposal. A very small fraction of each transaction would be taxed, payable in tax, which could be used for progressive ends. Which was in those circumstances to tackle global poverty or to tackle climate change. That seems to me to be a perfectly, if I was Rachel Reeves now, I would be thinking, what would I rather do? Would I rather be raising £10 billion for a financial transaction tax, or would I rather be breaking my manifesto pledge and banging up income tax by 1p in the pound? I mean, I know which one I would go for.
Interesting point, because it leads me to another item which I wanted to talk to you about. You said at the beginning there's no reason for tax increases, and I agree with you. I mean, we put out a couple of videos recently saying there's no reason for tax increases unless they're on the wealthy, which should be matched by tax cuts for those who are poorer inside our society. And, excuse the language, but we do have a division, and you talked about it as being something that's important to you. Wealth taxation is obviously on the agenda. What do you view the issue as? Is it one about taxing wealth per se? Is it about having a new mansion tax? Is it about increasing income taxes on the wealthiest or improving the taxation of capital? Where are you on all that?
I'm not a particular fan of a new standalone wealth tax or a mansion tax. I mean, for pragmatic reasons, really, which is that it's just going to be incredibly hard to assess people's wealth or the value of their home. It's going to require a massive and ongoing bureaucracy to actually make it happen or make it work. But that doesn't mean that there are no taxes on wealth that can't be increased. I mean, we already have taxes on wealth which could be tweaked or changed or raised or amended. And I think, as you've said, Richard, I think you've done some quite, a lot of work on this. There are extensions, which could raise vast amounts of money quite easily. So, I'm a big fan of your idea that you should have one rate of tax relief on pensions rather than have a top 40% taxpayers or having tax relief at that rate. Why not have either everybody gets tax relief at 20% or everybody gets tax relief at 30%? But I mean, that's a tax on wealth, which is easily achieved, and and probably not that difficult politically to finesse. So there are taxes which can be imposed on existing wealth rather than creating a whole new system of wealth taxation, in my view.
You're sending a book to the publisher, you told me just before we started recording. It's going very soon. What's the book called? Who's it with? And tell us the core arguments.
Okay, it's tentatively called Making Good, and it's a book which talks about the need to rebuild the supply side of the British economy after 40 years of failed neoliberalism. Essentially, it's the first bit of the book takes to pieces the idea that somehow or other neoliberalism was good for us, that privatization, smashing the trade unions, trickle down wealth, all those free trade, all those things were somehow beneficial to the economy. They were beneficial, but to a very, very small number of people. And essentially, what's happened is the supply side of the British economy is withered away, particularly the manufacturing base. So it argues that we should be rebuilding manufacturing, and we should be using quite radical methods to do so. So nationalisation of more of the UK economy, forcing UK companies, pension funds to invest more in the UK, use of procurement, use of capital controls to try and rebuild the supply side of the UK economy. And it's with two mates of mine, Doug Nichols, who's an old trade unionist, and Kostas Lapafitsas, who's a professor of economics at SOAS. And it's going to be published sometime next year. It's just off to the printers. So, and it essentially says that if we're serious about tackling climate change, you need capital controls to do so. So that's broadly the argument.
I like that last twist that you threw in there, because I think in a global world, we still do actually have to control things locally as well. And we can't just let the world pretend that it floats freely over and above the issue of climate change, which is what global neoliberalism does. It pretends it's not there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm quite optimistic about change happening. I mean, it's a strange way. Trump's arrival, although he's obviously a hideous man in most respects, has actually been the catalyst for people on the progressive left to say, "Oh, blimey, didn't think we could do that." So it's been good. It's been good for political debate. The other thing that
a 1931 moment for Ramsay MacDonald. Nobody told me I could come off the gold standard. Yeah,
no one told us we could do that.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing I think is how in the post the pandemic, British politics has splintered into many parts. But it's not just the Tories that are in crisis. We could be witnessing the wipeout of both the political parties which have dominated British politics for 100 years. It's not just the Tories that are facing existential crisis. In my view, it's the Labour Party. They're also facing existential crisis.
I agree.
And they need some new thinking and some new ideas, because at the moment it looks to me as though all the new ideas are being espoused or being taken up by the smaller parties, not just in some ways the Green Party, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, even Reform UK are actually acting as catalyst for change here, and that's a good thing in my view.
Okay, I don't ever like these podcasts lasting too long. I've enjoyed our conversation, but there's a word that jumped out from what you just said, which was optimism, and that you feel optimistic about change. And most people don't. So just give me your vision of how optimistic change is going to take place. Let's conclude with that thought that you've got on that.
I mean, I think it's partly because we're of an age where we remember when things were organised. Maybe this is rose-tinted spectacles, but it seems to be organised in a better way.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible to do things A, differently, and B, better. It is possible to construct an economy which where real wealth creation takes place as opposed to extracting wealth by a bunch of spivs, and a bunch of asset strippers. So it is possible to actually rebuild the British manufacturing sector. It is possible to actually tackle poverty, I think. And it's probably going to take another. Sadly, back in 2008, you and I thought that was the moment when progressive change would become inevitable. 17 years later, we're waiting for it. It didn't. We're waiting for it to happen, and as a result, things have just moved sideways or backwards during that period.
Yeah.
But I think we can create a cleaner, better, fairer world, and that is within our grasp. But it's not. It doesn't depend on the ideas, because the ideas are there. It depends on the ideas being taken up by the people with the power to actually affect change. But I don't see that. And it's sorry.
No, then you finish. I thought you had, and I interrupted.
No, I had finished.
Okay, look, I think that's an optimistic point, and one that I entirely agree with you. I think the ideas are there. I think we have explored ideas. The last 17 years actually have not gone entirely to waste. There are ideas that people are picking up. And as you note, some of the smaller parties are definitely receptive because they realize that this is happening. I mean, we're in the extraordinary situation that the difference in polling numbers between the Greens, Lib Dems, Tories and Labour at the time we're recording is 2%, according to YouGov, with Reform, okay, 9 points ahead of any of them, I think it stands at present. But that's so volatile a situation that this change is possible. And I like that idea because I think you and I are both going to be around for long enough to see some of that change happen. And that's certainly my plan. And you obviously have.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, we're both sort of relatively recently retired. You're writing books, I'm producing podcasts and videos and so on. And all of that is an indication of the passion for change. Larry, thank you for sharing your passion for change. I much appreciate it. We'll talk again, perhaps, when something happens or when your book is out, and we'll remind the world it's there. But thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure, Richard.